My name is İpek Kocaömer Yosmoğlu. I'm the new president of OTSA, and my colleague and friend, the former president of OTSA, Baki Tezcan, is here, and he will be introducing our speaker today. I'm moderating the discussion. But before they do that, I wanted to remind you once again, I know you already know about this, but OTSA is having its first in-person, first ever conference, and it's going to be taking place at Northwestern University, 25th, 26th, and 27th October. Please do register if you haven't done so. Please do come. Please put it in your plans and your calendar, and also please, if you can spare it, pay something as you register. Registration is free, but for those of you who can, spring for, I don't know, a little something for the organization, we would appreciate it very much. We are preparing an amazing program for you, and we'll also have a lot of fun. So I'm just going to leave it there. We have only 1 hour for this event, so I'll hand it over to Baki, who's going to be introducing our speaker.
Hi, my name is Baki Tezcan. I teach at the University of California in Davis, and I'm the past president of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. I no longer am organizing WhatsApp meetings. I am only doing this one because I had promised Vladimir that we would have a meeting on his book, and then it just not got done around. I couldn't get around doing it early in the year. So I'm so glad that İpek is now organizing these meetings again, and it's starting with Vladimir's book. So I'm here just to introduce him. And then during the question and answer session, I could also run that just for everybody's information. You could raise your hand using Zoom's digital raise hand function to say your question out loud in recording, or you could also put it on chat, and then I would read the question out loud, and then Vladimir would answer it. So let me introduce our speaker, who, for those of you who are here, I guess, don't need an introduction, but we are also recording for YouTube, so hopefully other people will be watching it too. Dr. Vladimir Hamid Troyansky is a historian of global migration and forced displacement and assistant professor of global studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research examines Muslim refugee migration and its role in shaping the modern world. He is the author of Empire of Refugees, North Caucasian Muslims and the Late Ottoman State, which came out of Stanford University Press earlier this year in 2024. His articles appeared in Past and Present, Comparative Studies in Society and History, International Journal of Middle East Studies, Slavic Review, and Critica. He received a PhD in history from Stanford University and served as a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University. Vladimir, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here live or watching it later. And many thanks to OTSA, to Baki, to İpek, and also to Jim and Allison. It is such an honor to be here and to be starting this series in this new academic year. Thank you. So I will share my screen right now. I'll be introducing my book, Empire of Refugees, which was published by Stanford University Press earlier this year in February. It is a transnational history of migration, and it looks at the resettlement of about 1 million refugees from the Caucasus in the Ottoman Empire. It examines how Muslim refugees transformed the late Ottoman Middle East and the late Ottoman Balkans, and also how the two empires, the Ottomans and the Russians, managed Muslim migration. And I will start today with the story of one family. In 1890, two half-brothers, Fuat and Javad Hutat, eagerly expected the arrival of their mother, Hanifa Hanım, from Russia. 10 years earlier, the two men had left their native Circassia in the northwestern Caucasus, and now they lived in Istanbul. The eldest brother, Fuat, was about to graduate from the prestigious Ottoman Military Academy in Istanbul. The youngest brother, Javad, was a lawyer looking for a job. They both were Circassian refugees who survived the ethnic cleansing of their kin by the Russian military in the 1860s. Their mother, Hanifa Hanım, safely arrived and registered with the Ottoman Refugee Commission, Muhacirin Komisyonu, a state agency tasked with resettling Muslim refugees throughout the Ottoman Empire. The brothers petitioned the government asking to settle their mother in Istanbul, closer to them, but the government refused and settled her and the rest of the family in southern Anatolia, near Adana. Jivat moved there to be with the family. Fuat stayed in Istanbul. So this upper status Circassian refugee family began a long quest to find a perfect settlement place for them to reunite and to rebuild their lives in the Ottoman Empire. And I know this story because a descendant of Jivat, 130 years later, kindly shared with me 58 letters in Ottoman Turkish that Fuat wrote to his brother. And those letters were spanning the Caucasus, Istanbul, Anatolia, and Greater Syria. And the family kept those letters all these years. So for the next half hour, we will follow this refugee family on their journey, and it will frame the discussion of this book and the discussion of history of Muslim refugee migration in the empire. The book has 7 chapters, and the first 2 offer a bird's eye view on trans-imperial migration. Chapter 1 examines what happened on the Russian side of the border, why so many North Caucasians became refugees. Chapter 2 provides a grand narrative of Ottoman migration and refugee policies and explains how the Ottomans constructed a refugee regime. The next 3 chapters are regional. They are microhistories of refugee resettlement in specific locations, in the heaviest resettlement provinces in the empire, in the provinces of Danube, of Damascus, and of Sivas, respectively in the Balkans, in the Levant, and in Anatolia, also in very different environmental conditions, in the steppe region of Dobruja, on the Black Sea, in the semi-arid desert of Jordan, and in high mountains of central Anatolia. And then the final chapters are thematic, and they examine different strategies that North Caucasian refugees took to survive. Chapter 6 reconstructs the making of the North Caucasian diaspora in the Ottoman Empire. And chapter 7 takes the book full circle by looking at those refugees who decided not to stay in the Middle East and who tried to go back to the Caucasus. So let me say a few words about the historical context for all this. By the mid-19th century, the North Caucasus, a mountainous region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, had a majority Sunni Muslim population. And most people who would end up refugees in the Ottoman Empire belonged to the following ethnic groups: Western Circassians living on the Black Sea coast, Eastern Circassians living at a much higher elevation, Abkhazians living on the coast between Circassians and the Georgians, and then Karachais, Balkars, Ossetians, Ingush, and Chechens in the high uplands and river valleys in the middle of the mountains, and about 30 different ethnic groups collectively known as Dagestanis on the Caspian coast. Most of these communities do not speak languages of the Indo-European, Turkic, or Semitic language families. Most languages here belong to the Northwest Caucasian and Northeast Caucasian language families that are unique to the Caucasus and are mutually unintelligible with each other. But in the 19th century, the dominant literary language in the Caucasus was Arabic, despite not being native to anyone in the region. Before the 19th century, communities in the North Caucasus were autonomous. They were not really part of the surrounding empires, Ottoman Empire, Iran, or Russia. Russia completed the conquest of the region by 1864, waging the so-called Caucasus War against indigenous Muslim communities. And in the final years of the war, 1863 and 1864, the Russian army carried out an ethnic cleansing of Western Circassians. It burned dozens of Circassian villages, which provoked mass flight. Within about 2 years, about half a million refugees, over 90% of the entire population, fled by boats across the sea to the Ottoman Empire. Since the 1990s, many Circassian activists in the Middle East in diaspora and also in the Caucasus within the Russian Federation called for the recognition of these atrocities as a genocide, Circassian genocide. The impact of this displacement was massive. It was the largest ethnic cleansing in Russian imperial history, and it allowed Russia to consolidate its control over the Caucasus. And then the arrival of Circassian refugees was also the largest refugee crisis in Ottoman history at that point, and one of the largest globally at the time. After the Caucasus War, emigration continued to the Ottoman Empire, and it extended to virtually every ethnic and social group. And people were migrating for different reasons. Much of the emigration stemmed from dispossession, because Russia passed land laws in the 1860s, and many Muslims lost their land and were often forcibly displaced. Internal displacement then bred further emigration. The abolition of slavery pushed out some wealthy North Caucasians, who then transplanted slavery from the North Caucasus to the Ottoman countryside. Slavery plays a huge role in the story and in this book. Slavery is present in every chapter of the book. And many families, like the Khutats, fled because they were pushed out by the new laws that were favoring the new settlers, Russian and Ukrainian farmers, and other Christian and Slavic farmers. Many Muslims emigrated because they perceived emigration to be their religious obligation. Overall, about 1 million people left the region as refugees. The death toll was massive. Many boats sank on their way to the Ottoman Empire, and then many survivors died of epidemics and hunger in the Ottoman Empire. So less than 1 million refugees probably lived to be resettled. Now, back to the Khutats. In the early 1890s, the Khutats found themselves dispersed in the Ottoman Empire. Fuat was in Istanbul, his mother, sister, and brother in a refugee camp near Adana, and their relatives in the Caucasus and Konya. The marshes near Adana were a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and thousands of refugees had died in those settlements. The Khutats petitioned the government, begging to move their family somewhere safe. Their dream was to find an empty place where they could establish a Circassian village and invite all their kin and friends to live together again. And that was a dream for many refugees. In 1892, the family managed to escape the deadly marshes, and they moved up into the mountains, into this fascinating region called Uzun Yayla, or the Long Plateau in central Anatolia. So in the 1860s, over 40,000 North Caucasian refugees set up 70 villages there. And this area to this day in the North Caucasian diaspora is known as Küçük Kafkasya, the Little Caucasus, because the Caucasus was sort of reconstructed in that mountain valley. And there's a chapter in the book about this valley. The Khutats were excited to be there. In the meantime, Fuat finished his studies and he joined the Ottoman military. He was sent to the headquarters of the 4th Ottoman Army in Erzincan. He would visit his family in their new home, and in his letters to Jivat, he sent detailed homeschooling curricula for the Khutat children, instructing them to be good children, good Ottoman children, and study Ottoman Turkish, because Ottoman Turkish was the future, but also to remain good Circassians and practice Cherkess customs. For example, Khutat boys were supposed to practice horse riding every day. His brother Jivat stayed with the family. He put aside his dreams of being a lawyer, and he was trying to hold the family together. Now let's have a look at what Ottoman refugee resettlement looked like. The Ottoman government resettled North Caucasian refugees in virtually every Ottoman province. North Caucasians settled in what today are 14 different nation states. In the 1860s, about half of Circassian refugees were sent to the Balkans. But then during the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78, almost all of them fled, evacuating with the retreating Ottoman army, and then they were not allowed to go back to the Balkans. So by the time of World War I, that's what the geography of resettlement looked like. There were over 1,100 refugee villages scattered from Eastern Thrace to Kurdistan and Jordan. I'm now going to switch from this map to a screenshot from my digital database. So this map contains the locations and demographic makeup of the villages. This data is based on my archival research, and the painstaking work of North Caucasian activists in Turkey and Jordan and Syria who publicly made their data available. Almost all of these villages were new. They were established in the 50 years before World War I. Most of them were monoethnic, and the map is color-coded for different ethnic groups. So this map only shows refugee villages of Muslims from the North Caucasus. You can imagine other layers to this. There were hundreds of refugee villages of Muslims from Crimea, from Georgia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Albania, Macedonia, and Crete. That's what the Ottoman Empire looked like at the end. There were so many new refugee villages across various Ottoman environments. Today, the North Caucasian diaspora counts about 2 to 3 million people in Turkey. It's the largest ethnic minority after the Kurds and now the Syrians. Up to 100,000 people in Syria, up to 50,000 in Jordan, and there are also smaller communities in Israel, Iraq, Egypt, and Libya. At this point, very few North Caucasians in the Middle East would speak the ancestral languages, but most speak Arabic or Turkish as their native language, depended on where they were settled in the late Ottoman period. Nevertheless, there are young people in their 20s who would grow up in places like Uzun and would speak Circassian as their first language. The preservation of heritage in many ways is actually remarkable, given how long ago this displacement happened. The central argument in the book is that between 1860 and World War I, the Ottoman government established a refugee regime for incoming Muslims. What is a refugee regime? A refugee regime is a set of principles, norms, and procedures governing the acceptance and resettlement of refugees. And usually when we talk about refugee regimes, we think about the 20th century, the establishment of the United Nations, and the contemporary international refugee regime anchored in the 1951 Refugee Convention. Some historians in our field made an argument that already in the interwar period, there was the first international refugee regime established by the League of Nations. This book shows that already in the second half of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was offering a package of protections that was similar to refugee protections that we expect today. The legislative basis of this refugee regime rested on two Ottoman laws, the immigration law and the land code. The immigration law of 1857 allowed immigration in the Ottoman Empire to everyone, irrespective of their religion. It was fairly liberal legislation. The Ottoman Empire wanted European farmers to immigrate and to bring their capital to establish farms and become productive taxpayers. So in this sense, the Ottoman government actually wanted to compete with the United States and other countries for European immigrants. The immigration law guaranteed free land and temporary benefits. For example, exemptions from taxation and military service from 6 to 12 years. The Land Code of 1858, a hugely important Ottoman law, standardized land tenure and land ownership throughout the empire. The government hoped with this law, among many other things, to centralize state control over agricultural land. And this legislation was favorable to immigrants. It allowed the government to confiscate the land from local populations that were not using the land or that were not paying tax on the land for 3 years, and then give that land to incoming immigrants in the hope that one day they would pay tax. To handle the arrival of hundreds of thousands of refugees from Russia, the Ottoman government founded the Ottoman Refugee Commission, Muhacirin Komisyonu, in 1860. This organization would then take the existing legislation for immigrants and build on it to construct a refugee regime. Because refugees escaping Russia arrived, they were very different from the immigrants that the Ottomans envisioned. They were arriving with nothing. There was no capital. People needed immediate help not to die in Ottoman ports. So the Refugee Commission, in addition to those exemptions, provided subsidies to refugees, financial aid, and grain to survive in the first years. Over the next half century, the Ottoman Refugee Commission evolved into one of the world's largest refugee resettlement agencies. It resettled anywhere between 3 and 5 million Muslim refugees mostly from Russia and the Balkans. That's the legislative basis. The ideological basis for this refugee regime is very different than what we have now with the contemporary refugee regime. It was based on the Ottoman empires or the Ottoman sultans' responsibility to protect Muslims wherever they lived. At the core of this refugee regime was the idea of hijrah. Hijrah is the journey of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina in the 7th century to protect the first Muslim community. Later in Islamic history, this concept came to denote a migration of Muslims living in a territory under non-Muslim rule to a Muslim territory, and it was widely interpreted as a religious obligation, a journey one must take to preserve their faith. In the 19th century, Hijrah became an anti-colonial movement, with so many Muslims fleeing European conquests and occupations, primarily to the Ottoman Empire, the Caliphate, and the strongest surviving Muslim sovereign state. Muslim refugees call themselves muhajir, which can be translated into English as refugee, immigrant, and emigrant. In the 19th century, this term had a very strong religious heritage. It really started losing that Muslim connotation only in the final decades of Ottoman rule. Muslim refugees from the Caucasus and Crimea and the Balkans almost exclusively used the term muhajir to describe themselves, and so did the Ottoman government. The Ottoman refugee regime guaranteed admission and resettlement for any displaced Muslim. Meanwhile, the Ottomans still had the immigration system through which non-Muslim immigrants, foreign Christians and foreign Jews, could enter the empire. And some did. So that's the story of Jewish migration to Ottoman Palestine in the late 19th century. But as a general rule, non-Muslims were not resettled by the Refugee Commission, they were not granted refugee subsidies, and their admission was not guaranteed. They had to negotiate it with the central Ottoman government. This refugee regime was serving the Ottoman state. The Ottomans were using Muslim refugees for all kinds of purposes, depending on where they settled them. And we can think for all those different reasons as three main refugee settlement objectives. So the first one was the Ottomans wanted to increase the rural and farming population and to boost agriculture. Refugees were only allowed to settle in the countryside. The Ottomans were really trying to prevent them from moving to cities. Second, the Ottoman government wanted to bring nomadic territories in Anatolia and the Levant under Ottoman control and kind of to extend Ottoman sovereignty more firmly there through refugees. And then third, after 1878, after the Treaty of Berlin, the government was using Muslim refugees to alter demographic ratios in the borderlands, specifically to increase Muslim population, especially in Greek and Armenian areas. And this is a very important point. Ethnic cleansing and humanitarianism often come together. We tend to imagine them as complete opposites, but they complement each other by design. In the Ottoman case, the resettlement of Muslim refugees went hand in hand with the displacement of Ottoman Christians, especially in the 1910s. By the time of World War I, the Ottoman government intended for Muslim refugees, at that point mostly from the Balkans, to take homes and lands of Christians, many of whom were deported and murdered in the Armenian genocide. Let's zoom back into the 1890s. The Hutats were growing concerned about their settlement in central Anatolia. They were worried about the deteriorating security in this mountain valley because the economy was failing. It was too cold, it was too mountainous, and it was too isolated. People couldn't export anything out of there. So they started looking for another place. Fuad wrote letters to his friends, other refugees, and in his letters to Javad, he discussed where the family could move. The options were moving to Konya, to Trabzon, to Malatya, and even settling near Istanbul. The Hutats' search for a perfect location in exile ended with an unexpected invitation. Javad, the younger brother, received a letter from a family they used to know in the Caucasus. The family were now refugees in a small Circassian village, hours of riding to the east of Jerusalem. And that village was Amman. Fuat was not keen on the idea of relocating the family to the edge of the Syrian desert, but Javad insisted on giving Amman a chance. So he went to check it out in 1896, and he liked it so much that he telegraphed Fuat for a money order, and then he immediately invested that money in buying land in Amman. The family was tied to that investment, so they had to move. They left Uzun Yayla, they went to Adana, by boat to Beirut, and then by land to Amman via Damascus. Javad finally found a career. He became a farmer, but also a real estate entrepreneur. His business strategy was simple. He would grow wheat, he would then sell grain to Transjordanian merchants and reinvest capital into more real estate, and repeat it. His brother remained in Eastern Anatolia to keep his military career, but he became a big supporter of his family's settlement on the edge of the Syrian desert because his superiors told him that one day the Ottomans might build a railway there and it will no longer be that isolated. He wrote many letters to his brother saying, however much you can save, put it back into the soil immediately. That is, turn it into real estate. There is nothing more valuable than land to get by in this world, end quote. The Hutas were not alone in their excitement about Jordan. Jordan was the southernmost area of refugee resettlement in the empire. The first Circassians arrived there in 1878, and by World War I, Circassian and Chechen refugees established 8 villages. Notably, 3 out of the 4 largest cities in Jordan today were founded by these Muslim refugees from the Caucasus. Amman now has 4 million people, and in the last couple of years, it became the largest city in the Levant, overtaking Damascus and Aleppo. But during World War I, it had the population of about 5,000 people, most of whom were Circassian refugees. So what did happen in Jordan? By examining local land records, I found that in Jordan, refugees received generous allotments of free land in accordance with the Ottoman refugee regime. And the Ottoman government consistently backed refugees, backed their right to that land in courts and through the local police force. Whenever local communities, Bedouin and Falahin, challenged refugees for the right to own that land. Refugees also actively used the Ottoman Land Code of 1858 to register and buy as much additional land as they could. And then they carefully recorded their transactions in new governmental land registries to safeguard their right to the land. And by doing that, they prompted everyone else, Bedouin, Falahin, and others, to do the same, not to lose their right to the land. Refugees throughout the empire were entrenching the new Ottoman land code, indirectly helping the Ottoman government to centralize its control over the land and enforce taxation. Refugees also benefited from the Hijaz Railway, which was built. It connected Damascus to Medina, and it went through Amman in 1903. The railway increased external interest in the region, and many Palestinian and Syrian merchants arrived in Amman to buy local wheat from Circassians. Circassians then started selling them their houses and their businesses, and some of those Palestinian and Syrian families that arrived, to this day, they are some of the economic elites of Amman and of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Over the 20th century, Amman became this quintessential refugee city. It expanded through successive rounds of displacement and through arrival of new refugees. The Armenian survivors of the genocide, the Palestinian refugees of 1948 and 1967, then Iraqi refugees, and now Syrian refugees. Amman's DNA is that of a refugee city, but this story, this is the Ottoman and Circassian refugee origin of now the largest city in the Levant. I would like to say a few words about my sources for this book. So this book is based on research in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Russian, and Bulgarian in over 20 archives in 10 countries, because I couldn't stop. And for the Ottoman side of the story, I worked in Turkey, in Osmanlı Arşivi, and also in Jordan, Bulgaria, Romania, the UK, and the United States. And this is a history of migration, and it operates on several levels. On one level, it's a study of Ottoman and Russian migration policies, and I was reconstructing them piece by piece I was reconstructing how legislation evolved, ultimately how migration policies propped up imperial governance. And I used many state records for that. I used government correspondence, police records, Sharia court records, tax registers, and land records. I was very fortunate to get access to Ottoman land records for the entire Amman area. I somehow got the security clearance from the Jordanian Interior Ministry, and I was sitting in a land registry office with, next to Jordanian officials who were receiving petitions live about land. So I really got to witness live how important, what kind of judicial value those records still have. And I was copying all those records for 3 weeks in pencil by hand. So I have a full database of property transactions that took place in the city involving refugees. And that allowed me to make estimates about property prices and to trace the arrival of Levantine capital. And that's how I show that in Jordan, Muslim refugees drove this new form of land speculation and capital accumulation, taking advantage of the favorable Ottoman land code and tapping into local Levantine networks of capital. But this book is also a bottom-up history of migration. It was very important for me to show as much as I could how refugees themselves perceived their displacement and their resettlement. So I was looking for refugee voices, and I found quite a few. For many years, I've been collecting private letters that refugees wrote, and it's a rare source in the study of migration in the Middle East. I found some letters preserved on the Russian side of the border, in the South and in the North Caucasus, or Russian imperial side of the border, letters that were smuggled into the Caucasus and apprehended by Russian officials. I also found letters in private family collections in Jordan. For example, 58 letters of the Hutat family. Private letters are an amazing source that provides all kinds of new perspectives in migration history. And I also looked at petitions, because petitioning was this very important part of the Ottoman refugee regime. The refugees expected officials to hear them, to hear their concerns, and to respond to them. And muhajirs petitioned all kinds of different agencies. They petitioned governors on the levels of Kaza, Sanjak, and Vilayet. They petitioned the Ottoman Refugee Commission. They petitioned the Sultan himself, and they were couching their concerns in different ways when they were speaking to different people. And I also conducted interviews with descendants of Circassian and Chechen refugees in Jordan and Turkey, and their recollections very much complemented my archival research. So to return to the political economy of the story, my book shows that the resettlement fortified Ottoman rule in the outlying regions of the Levant and of Anatolia. It also accelerated the collapse of Ottoman rule in the Balkans. In the Balkans, the Ottomans did not invest enough in resettling refugees in the 1860s, which led to the economic collapse of refugee villages. It led to banditry, which escalated to Muslim-Christian violence in 1876, which contributed to the Russo-Ottoman War and the Ottoman loss of Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania. Historians explain the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in two main ways. Through geopolitics, because the Ottomans were losing wars in the 19th and early 20th centuries, or through cultural forces like nationalism and sectarianism, which destroyed the fabric of Ottoman society and how people related to each other. So this book enriches the story by showing that Muslim refugee resettlement had a profound impact on actually reinvigorating the empire in some regions towards the end, regions like Jordan, but also areas in central Anatolia. So what happened to the Hutats? Javad and his family stayed in Jordan. Javad dusted off his legal training, he improved his Arabic, and became an attorney for Circassian refugees in Amman. Another family history that I tell in this book is that of the wealthiest person in central Transjordan, who happened to be a Circassian refugee woman, Sayed Khan, and Javad Hutat was her lawyer. Meanwhile, Fuat moved back to Istanbul, a city that he loved. He became a superintendent of the Ottoman Military Academy. He also got married to an Armenian woman, Shefika, whom he met in Erzincan. They had 3 kids. In 1913, the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, carried out a coup, and after the installed Grand Vizier was assassinated, they unleashed a purge of the liberal opposition. Fuat was arrested and executed. According to family memories, all charges against him were false. His widow, Shefika, and their 3 children moved to Amman to be with the rest of the family during World War I. They then came back to Istanbul. All 3 children received good education and grew up as the first generation of the new Turkey. Their daughter graduated from the American College for Girls, one of the best schools in the country. Their youngest son became a lawyer, like his Transjordanian uncle Javad. Their oldest son became an army officer, like his late father, Fuat. Since then, the family had been split. Javad's descendants live in Amman, Fuat's descendants live in Istanbul. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, some of the descendants of Javad went back to the Caucasus, and they were using Fuat's letters and notes over a century old to find the village where they were from and to meet some of their family in the Caucasus. We have to say goodbye to the Khutats here. To conclude, I want to elaborate on a couple of contributions that this book makes. The Ottoman refugee regime offers us a new way to think about the history of global refugee migration and resettlement. So we have this system here that was set up in response to European colonialism, but it was based on a distinct genealogy rooted in Islamic history. And this terminology of hijra and muhajir have a lot to offer in how we conceptualize a refugee and think about distinctions between refugee, immigrant, and emigrant, and also a settler. And the vocabulary of hijra and muhajir is salient today because it's so meaningful to many displaced Muslim communities all across Eurasia in the 20th and 21st centuries. The Ottoman refugee regime also endured in many forms. After the empire ended, Ottoman legislation and infrastructure and know-how of settling people was inherited by the new nation states, by Turkey, by states in the Levant, and even in the Balkans, which built their migration systems on the foundations of the Ottoman refugee regime. Second, displacement in the Ottoman and Russian empires ought to be studied together. This story is intertwined with ethnic cleansing and sectarianism, the starkly different treatment of Christian and non-Christian subjects in the Tsarist Caucasus, and Muslim and non-Muslim migrants in the Ottoman Empire were symptoms of a broader sectarian order. By the late 19th century, religious identity and perceptions of one's loyalty to the empire dangerously converged, which paved the way to ethnic cleansing and genocide in parts of the Middle East, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. So to understand the history of the region, I think we should look at Muslim displacement from the Caucasus and Crimea at the Armenian genocide, at the Greek-Turkish population exchange, at Stalin's deportations from the Caucasus and Crimea in the 1940s, together in one transnational frame. And then finally, refugee migration is central to late Ottoman history. What this book reveals is the Ottoman origins of organized refugee resettlement in the Middle East. The Ottoman government used Muslim refugee resettlement to solidify imperial rule in the outlying areas, especially nomadic and Christian areas, to centralize its control over agricultural land and to enforce taxation. Muslim refugee resettlement was critical to the very nature of the late Ottoman state. The Ottoman legitimacy and imperial hold on some regions became dependent on the continued admission of Muslim refugees. The Ottoman economy and demographics were reshaped through the immigration of Muslims from Russia and then from the Balkans. The late Ottoman Empire was an empire of refugees. Thank you very much, and I'm so looking forward to the discussion and the questions. Thank you.
Vladimir, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm a big fan of your work, and it connects to so many things I'm interested in, personally, because this term muhajir, you would know, in the 20th century, it continues to be used. All of my family, especially my mother's side, identify themselves as muhajir. But I'm not going to get into personal things. There are a lot of questions here, and I hope there will be a lot of questions. Let me check the until somebody asks a question by raising their hand, I'll ask you something right away. I'm not quite sure whether you had a chance to touch on this. Well, actually, you probably not as much, but there is also an interesting connection between the North Caucasian migrants and security apparatus. They are overrepresented in Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, and they continue to be overrepresented in security agencies of Turkey and apparently neighboring countries. I was told an anecdote, and the anecdote, the person who told me this swore that it was right, because she heard it from someone who was part of the group. The story goes like this. You know, a number of security agency representatives are having a meeting during the Cold War. Somebody from Turkey, somebody from Jordan, somebody from Syria, somebody from Egypt, and then the American representative to Moscow. They're all meeting, and then it turns out they're all Caucasians. So this joke kind of, I guess, represents this idea that they are so overrepresented. How did that come about? Did you find sort of clues about this in your studies? Did you hear stories like this? Did you notice that that is the case in Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa and later Turkish army forces and the police, etc., etc.?
Thank you so much, Baki. Yeah, I've heard many stories like this, of course, during my fieldwork. So there are Ottoman origins to this story, right? Of course, right now in the 20th, early 21st century, there's this association between North Caucasians, especially, I would say, Jordan and Syria, perhaps to a lesser extent Turkey, right, with the security apparatus, with the military. So in the 1860s, when people were resettled throughout the empire, they had exemptions from military service. So they were not immediately recruited in the Ottoman army. The breaking point is 1877-78 Russo-Ottoman War, when the Ottomans really need people to fight on the front lines. And that's when the exemptions start expiring as well. So that's when many Caucasians and others get recruited into the military. And then, you know, their kind of careers continue, their rise continues. We should also keep in mind that this resettlement was very rural. People were in the countryside. Opportunities for social advancement were very few. So for many North Caucasian Muhajir boys and young men, like that was the way to get out of the village and, you know, to achieve social advancement. So after 1878, people like the Hutats, Fuad Hutat was encouraging boys in the Hutat family to join the military, right? Like they were rising through the ranks. So by the time we get to World War I, yes, many Muhajirs are in the military or in the security apparatus. And then when the empire collapses, these refugee communities, I mean, their politics is fascinating. They had to survive. So they were forging new relations with all those new regimes, with the Turkish national movement, with the Greek occupying forces, with the British and the French military authorities, etc. And one thing that refugee communities could offer was, you know, the military skills, right, and the militias that some of those, you know, Circassian and other commanders assembled around them during World War I. So there is very much like a stacked Ottoman origin to the story of this militarization. But again, we have to remember that by the time of World War I, the majority of North Caucasian diaspora was still very much farmers. Like they were tilling the countryside rather than, you know, employed in the military or militias of any kind.
Yes, thank you. Is it possible that the kalpak that these late Ottoman officers wore came through them? Because kalpaks are not really, you know, part of Ottoman headgear until the very end, but it is so Caucasian. I don't want to put you on the spot. Probably this would require a little bit of extra research to answer. And there are other questions waiting. I see Madonna Ghazal. If I remember correctly, she was at UCLA. Am I right, Madonna?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, go ahead, please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I can't wait to read the book and read more about the slavery component. But I have a specific question about the legal status of refugees. So for wealthy refugees who did not need the support of the government, did they have freedom of movement within the empire? And my second question regards the status of the children of refugees. Were they given Ottoman nationality? And if so, does that mean that they were free to move and move out of these settlements?
Fantastic. Thank you very much for these questions. So the wealthy refugees, many of them moved straight to the cities, right? And they would not even be counted sometimes as muhajir. So they're often not included in Ottoman statistics. They just move to Ottoman cities and, kind of we lose trace of them. Often the connection between those wealthy refugees and people who were their clients in the Caucasus back in the day is lost. So there's also a story in this book about the how North Caucasian refugees throughout the empire, they had to create new leadership. New leadership was rising because this scattering across the empire and because their wealthy class was often in the cities. And if you move to the cities, if you don't get the status of muhajir, then you of course do not get free land and all those exemptions. However, the aristocracy from the Caucasus who moved to Istanbul and Sivas and Damascus, they often got many favors, like from the central government, and they often very quickly began career in the Ottoman military or administration. And then with regards to nationality, there was a very clear path to naturalization, which was inherent in the Ottoman immigration law of 1857. So the muhajirs had to wait for a couple of years before they could officially become Ottoman citizens. However, in practice, when they arrived in the Ottoman Empire and when they were receiving, free land and when they were receiving financial aid from the Refugee Commission before it would send them somewhere in the countryside, they had to declare their loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan. So in practice, they were treated as Ottoman subjects from the get-go. And if they arrived, and that was a minority, with Russian passports, the Russian passports were taken away by the Ottoman Refugee Commission. So in practice, there was no process of application for naturalization. They were treated as Ottoman subjects from the get-go, usually.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, the next in line is Ozan Ceyhan. He is the, I guess, I don't know what one would call that, Chief Research Officer, maybe, for Mutaferrika, the database for late Ottoman and actually all printed Ottoman things. Ozan Bey, please go ahead.
Thank you, Baki Hocam, for the introduction. Thank you for your kind presentation, Vladimir. I would like to ask if I didn't miss anything related to the reason for settlement. As I have seen in your map, Sivas, Balıkesir has been chosen for settlement. Is there a specific reason specifically stated in the state papers that why we should settle these people in Sivas or Balıkesir? Is it only because of the, as you mentioned in your presentation, because people who didn't run the field for 3 years, so we should leave it? Or is there a specific population density reason, as you know, Sivas, so there can be some obvious reasons. I just wonder if it has been stated in the papers that Sivas because this, or Balıkesir because this. Thank you in advance.
Thank you so much. Let me very quickly share that map again.
Thank you, please.
So why people were settled in certain places, like it's an incredibly complicated story because there was no just one decision-making agency. Yes, there was an Ottoman Refugee Commission in Istanbul, but it also had many branches. in almost all provinces. On top of that, the provincial governors, they also had the power to say where exactly in each province the refugees would go. And then there were also other commissions on the Sanjak and Kaza level. So it's very complicated. But generally speaking, here's the picture. In the 1860s, when about 500,000 Circassian refugees come in, it's a massive humanitarian refugee crisis. The Ottomans want to settle these people, want to move them away from the ports as quickly as possible. And that's why in the 1860s, so much of resettlement is very close to the shoreline, right? It's around Western Anatolia, Northern Anatolia, and also the coastline of the Eastern Balkans. Then after 1877-78 war, as I mentioned, the Ottomans are much more strategic about the value of those refugees in changing the demographics of the empire. So they're settling them a bit more strategically. And that's where we see many people are kind of moving like inland and farther east. However, there was also that element that you mentioned, I think, overpopulation and density. Many regions on the coastline at that point, there was really not enough land. And yes, when the Ottomans were discussing the Sivas province, there was a belief that in central Anatolia, there was more free land that was available, right? So they were intentionally like putting people in places where there is more land. When we look at the discussions on the ground, almost everyone was saying that there is not enough free land almost anywhere, right? So this picture is, of course, that muhajirs from the North Caucasus or from elsewhere, they had to constantly compete for the land which was given to them for free by the Ottoman government. Because from the perspectives of the local populations, that land was often not the Ottoman governments to give, it belonged to their ancestors, right? And so they saw the refugees as kind of settlers, right? But yes, that's kind of that's the general picture.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vladimir.
Thank you. And now we have Onur Bozkurt, who had raised his hand. Onur Bey, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for a nice presentation. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to ask that it seems to me that Circassians are the most well-adapted ethnic group in Turkish society, not just because of religion, in my opinion, but I'm not 100% sure or correct, but it seems to me like that in terms of integration. Do you think it's like that? If so, why do you think it's like that? Is it because of the early period immigration or else? Or maybe they are well inducted into higher Ottoman hierarchy? You know, as you said, they were also active in revolutionary wars also, not just Ottoman pre-revolutionary war period. So why do you think it's like that? Also, it's a kind of fun fact, but it's not also 100% applicable to this situation. But muhajir is mostly said for people immigrated from Caucasia, but göçmen, which is also same meaning, but it's pure Turkish, which is also said for people who immigrated from Balkans or Greece. Mostly myself is also from my mother's side, Balkan, Macedonian immigrant. So it's kind of a fun fact. It's a kind of a new times, old times situation. Mr. Tezcan can also approve this or not. I'm not sure. This is it. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much for these two questions. So about Circassian adaptation, it's a complicated one because on the one hand, okay, in the last 2 decades of the empire, there is this kind of convergence of Ottoman identity, right? As it was promoted by this, CUP, and Muslim identity and Turkish identity. And North Caucasians, most of them, they were not Turkic. However, they were very much accepted into that fold. So in some ways, there was an acceptance from the get-go. However, after 1923, there were many accusations against the North Caucasian community, like of treachery during the Turkish War of Independence. So actually, it's been incredibly hard for many North Caucasian communities in Turkey. And the adaptation, it's a tricky term to use because between 1923 and the 1950s, these people could not publicly use their languages, right? They could not publish in their languages, right? There was such heavy Turkification. So much of adaptation is people's need to survive, right? Like whether in the late Ottoman period or in the Turkish Republican period. So yes and no, I guess. It's complicated just like it is for any other ethnic and especially religious minority in modern Turkey. Now, when it comes to göçmen, so göçmen, it's a neologism in Turkish, right? It's a much later term, and it in many ways came to supplant the term muhacir, right? So much of the Turkish literature describing the muhacirs, they would refer to them as göçmen at all. All those terms, right, they changed their meaning over the past century. So muhacir meant so many different things, right? As I mentioned, in the middle of the 19th century, it had this very strong religious baggage. But then towards the end of the empire, it is being used to describe Christian immigrants in the empire and Jewish immigrants in the empire and Greek and Armenian deportees within the empire who just survived the genocide. So it kind of becomes this term for anyone on the move. To complicate the picture, there's the term mülteci, right, that comes in the picture. It always meant something like a political exile in the empire, but then it becomes to be used almost interchangeably with muhacir in the last final decades, to the point that in 1911, I think, the Ottoman government had to clarify what mülteci is and what muhacir is, and the difference came down to citizenship. It's whether your foreign citizenship is disavowed when you enter the Ottoman Empire, or whether you still hold it and you need to disavow it and then apply for naturalization. So this old terminology that is so rooted in hijra all of a sudden gets tied to something as modern as citizenship, right? As the Ottoman Empire was reforming its citizenship laws. So yes, thank you.
I can say that for the immigrants from Bulgaria who came as late as 1950, which includes my mother, they identify themselves as muhajir. I was just in Bulgaria actually with my mother, visiting her village where we found a relative, and they were talking of themselves as muhajir, continues to today. Anyway, I don't want to lengthen that. We kind of ran out. Oh, Ipek's hand is up, and then there's one question that came through chat. I will read the question first, and then Ipek's question will be next.
I actually don't have a question.
Oh.
No, I just wanted to like add something to what Vladimir just said about, mülteci, because like he pointed out, this is, an entirely different category that also had to be defined at different points. And you mentioned to 1911 and 1916, there's a different definition. I forget now who comes up with it, but it says that so people who are coming from countries that were ceded as a result of a treaty, those are muhajir. But if they're fleeing war or occupation, then those are called mülteci. So there's a distinction between, what is, of course, after the fact considered lawful, and then, at the time considered occupation, and therefore, against international legal norms.
Right. And when I said 1911, I meant 1913. But yes, thank you. Like the way the legislation evolves and all those meanings change, it's fascinating. And it's exciting as a historian to study that evolution.
All right. Thank you. Ayşe Hümeyra sent this note and the question. Thank you very much for the presentation. Vladimir argues that the idea of hijra in Islam lies at the core of Ottoman refugee regime. I'm wondering, what was the importance of tabiyet, citizenship, in this regime compared to the idea of hijra? To my knowledge, Jewish refugees with Ottoman citizenship were welcomed by the Ottomans.
Yeah. So, of course, all this immigration is very much tied to also naturalization, right? And subjecthood that is bestowed to the new immigrants. Yes, as I mentioned, there was the Ottoman immigration system that was continuing alongside the Ottoman refugee regime. And if you immigrate through the immigration system, like many Jewish refugees in the 1880s, 1890s, and later, yeah, they would, in accordance with the Ottoman immigration law of 1857, receive Ottoman subjecthood. However, some of them did not arrive with the prior permission of the Ottoman government, right? I mentioned that for the non-Muslims, it had to be really negotiated. And so for a while, they did not have Ottoman subjecthood, and arguably, perhaps legally, were not eligible for it. However, there were many different ways, and some people were getting subjecthood, some people were not. This is an incredibly complex history, the history of immigration of non-Muslims, because it was done on such an ad hoc level.
Thank you. There are two new questions, I think. Vehbi Baysan, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I cannot see myself, but anyway. Oh, okay, video is here. Great. Thank you, Vladimir. It was really nice, a good talk. I benefited a lot. Since you have spoken about the family histories, I have a very interesting one, and that's my question will be followed, because I'm married to one of them. Now, these immigrants, interestingly employed by the Ottoman Empire to establish or for the maintenance of the telegram routes, appointed to Saida in Lebanon and some parts of Syria, and they ended up being in Jordan. Now, after the collapse of Ottoman Empire, or let's say the establishment of Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, they were kept employed, and they kind of designed or established Jordan's telecommunication systems by even being right arm to King Hussein. And even their son, which happens to be my father-in-law, became a minister of higher education there. Why am I telling you this is that the story, and they have very valuable memory, and hopefully one day will be published. Now, is it the same for the Turkish case? I mean, would they be employed by the Turkish Republic in 1930s, 40s? What was the situation? Those who were educated remain, because you gave an example of bitter experience. One seems to have lost his life from the Khutat family. So Jordanian seems kept them aside, and still is. I know, I'm in touch. But what was the case in Turkish Republic? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm very sorry, Vladimir. I just got notice that we should be ending soon. Therefore, I'm going to ask Karalampos to share their question now as well, and then you can answer both of them at once. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation and for the wonderful book. I read it last month. It was really helpful. I want to ask something. In 1921, when the Greek army withdraws from Yalova, many Circassians, many thousand Circassians follow the Greek army in Thrace. And some of them go to Greece, some of them receive land with the Christian refugees, while in the end of 1920s and the beginning of 1930s, they lose the privileged relation with the Venizelos party, and some of them leave to Syria and Jordania. The archives in Syria and Jordania provide this information about their immigration and the reasons of their immigration in 1920, after 1925 and until 1935. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll start with this one. Thank you so much, Karalampos. Yeah, there are later waves of migration, right? Like through Greece and then to Jordan and Syria. There's also even another one during World War II, people directly from the Caucasus who joined their kin in Jordan and Syria. And then eventually, some of them, many of them, because so many settled in the Golan Heights, they were expelled in 1967, and so many ended up in the United States, actually. So there's so many layers of migration, right, even in the 20th century to this story. And then to Vehbi, so Jordan and Syria are pretty special cases here, because in the beginning of the 20th century, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was such a reliance on minorities in many ways, right, by the French and the British authorities, and then the Transjordanian authorities. So Circassians were very much recruited and were occupying also by the value of their being in Amman, that became the capital of Jordan, right? In Turkey, it depends. It really depends on where people settled, and as you mentioned, on the level of their education. So those who were heavily Ottomanized, right, and who spoke good Turkish, and who at that point lived either in cities or somewhere close to cities, yeah, it was much more likely for them to be employed by the state enterprises already in the 1920s and 1930s. I will also mention that you mentioned the settlement next to the telegraph lines. So that was very much part of the Ottoman story. The Ottomans were, after 1878 especially, resettling refugees close to the railway lines, both in the Levant and in Anatolia, and the telegraph lines, where refugees could protect them, to build them in the first place, and then also protect them from nomads and whomever. And this practice, you know, it has the earlier origins in Ottoman history, in the early modern period. Like, this is the derbend that the Ottomans had practiced. So this story, right, like, it ties into the 20th century, 21st century so much, but also, of course, it had roots in earlier centuries of the Ottoman Empire, and some of the experience that the Ottomans gained in resettling people, but now they were really centralizing it, like, through the construction of this Ottoman refugee regime. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you have something in response to Vehbi Baysan's comments or question? That was the first one, I think, right? Vehbi? Oh, you answered that too? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Okay. Great. Then we are already 8 minutes over, so let's just finish right here. Thank you so much to everyone who came and participated with questions, with listening. Of course, greatest thanks to Vladimir. And İpek, do you want to say something? Remind everybody of the conference.
Well, I did the conference program is on the OTSA website. So you can take a look at it there. And also we have the series WOTS'Ap Fridays going to take place on Fridays. We have a speaker every month going up to April or March, I think. So March. So it's also on the website, so you can take a look at the schedule there. And we will soon announce the speakers for April, May, and June. We have 3 more coming, so stay tuned.
That is great. And this is my last WhatsApp. From now on, you will see İpek or maybe Jim. I don't know, depending on who's available. Have a great weekend, everyone. And thank you so much, Vladimir. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.